Hello and welcome to our audience. Thank you from wherever you're joining us. My name is Nyoka Acevedo, and I'm with the Andrus Family Fund, as Manuela mentioned, co-conveners of Education Anew, Shifting Justice, and I'll be a moderator for this conversation. A little bit about me. I came into the field of philanthropy after many years in the youth justice and education justice space, having trained organizations and school districts on restorative justice practices and policy implementation. I look at restorative justice as one of the markers when we talk about abolition on the path to abolition, right? And so this work that I did in the field of restorative justice really forced me to interrogate our society's addiction to punishment, and more specifically, the anti-Black roots of punitive measures. So with that, I'm really honored to host this very timely and necessary conversation. And I also want to lift that, I want to thank those of us on this call who have long engaged in the work of abolition, and welcome those who are joining us for the very first time and are coming to now learn about abolition. Our hope is that no matter where you are in your learning, that you'll gain something insightful from today's exchange. Ultimately, the work of abolition is experiential, and it's about creating a new world, one that's more fair, just, and equitable for all. At the Andrus Family Fund, we resource organizations that work at the intersection of child welfare, social and racial justice, with a particular focus on improving outcomes for youth ages 16 to 24. We see this work as intersectional and systemic. And we also want to acknowledge that while the conversation of abolition is fairly new in the mainstream context, the practice of abolition and of building power and building communities of care and building alternatives to incarceration and exploring models of repairing harm have long existed. Organizations such as Common Justice, which advances solutions to violence that transform the lives of those harmed without relying on incarceration, is just one example of some of the alternatives to incarceration that exist out there. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce our esteemed panelists and dig into this very necessary conversation. But first, I'm going to share a brief agenda so that you know what to expect during our time together. I'll moderate this conversation until about 3:20 or so, and at which point we'll turn to the audience and open the dialogue, open the conversation up for questions. I'm going to ask that if folks have questions, they drop them in the Q&A box that is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you should see that right to the bottom, sort of to the right of your screen. And although we have a limited amount of time together, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can in both real time and during our Q&A period. So thank you for your patience with us. First, we have joining us as Monifa Bandele, and Monifa sits on the policy table for the Movement for Black Lives, as well as the steering committee for the New York-based Communities United for Police Reform. Just in the past decade, she led the launch of 2 historic and successful legal cases against police misconduct, worked to pass landmark police reform legislation in New York City, and was a contributing writer to M4BL's Vision for Black Lives. Thank you for joining us today, Monifa. Next, we have Erin Cloud from Movement for Family Power. Erin is the founding co-director of Movement for Family Power and is a dedicated advocate for families who are policed by the foster system. She has represented over 400 parents in child protective proceedings and supervised many more during her time at the Bronx Defenders. In addition to her work as a supervising attorney, Erin was also a team leader and special projects coordinator at the Bronx Defenders. As a team leader, she managed an interdisciplinary team of advocates, and her special project involved the close supervision of cases where women were drug tested at birth. And I believe she's going to go into a little bit about that today. And the test results were used as the primary allegation of neglect. These cases represented an intersection of drug policy and reproductive justice that required advanced litigation. For Erin, this work is personal. As a Black mother of 2 children, she recognizes that her actions at mothering are scrutinized on a different level than her white peers. She's seen Child Protective Services police and surveil members of her own family. Thank you for joining us today, Erin. Next, we have Zach Norris, Executive Director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and author of the brilliant book, We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities, and is co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that will empower Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice system and make a safe and secure future possible for themselves and for their families. Zach is also a co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. And Zach is definitely going to dive into this during our conversation today, so I'm really excited about this. Zach also helped build California's first statewide network for families of incarcerated youth, which led the effort to close 5 youth prisons in the state, passed legislation to enable families to stay in contact with their loved ones, and defeated Prop 6, a destructive and ineffective criminal justice ballot measure. Thank you for joining us today, Zach. And finally, we have the brilliant Ashley Sawyer from Girls from Gender Equity. Ashley is committed to dismantling systems of oppression and creating opportunities for Black youth, youth of color, and marginalized people. Ashley is the Senior Director of Campaigns at Girls for Gender Equity in Brooklyn, New York. At GGE, Ashley works to ensure that cisgender and transgender girls and non-binary youth are heard by elected officials and that their needs are reflected in city, state, and policy decisions. Ashley was previously a staff attorney at Youth Represent, where she led the reentry legal representation for girls and youth placed in the girls unit on Rikers Island, which is the largest jail in New York City and quite possibly the country. She is committed to dismantling pathways to criminalization for girls and women. She supported the legal representation of youth facing school suspension hearings. She's represented young people in misdemeanor charges in criminal court, license hearing, housing court, and civil legal issues. Ashley's life work is situated where education, justice, and the criminal legal system collide. And to that, she is committed to ending violence against women, particularly Black girls. And Ashley, we welcome you to the space today. So thank you all again for joining us. And that was a lot to share as I went through each person's bio, but I did want to read out the bios because I think it's important that we lift the brilliance that we have at this table today. And each person is coming to this conversation with a very particular expertise and perspective on what abolition is, right? And so I want to open up this very first question for all of the panelists to answer. When our larger community, those who aren't involved in social justice movement work, so I'm talking about our families, right? Our aunts, our uncles, our cousins, our neighbors. When folks hear the word abolition, they think about those who fought for the abolition of slavery. That's pretty much the first thought that comes to mind. Now, here we are again, many generations later, calling for abolition once again. Can you share what abolition means in this modern day context, in a 2020 context? And this question is open to all panelists to respond to.
I think it's a great question. So first I would say that abolition has never gone away. It's not like it started with an abolition of slavery and now we're in 2020 thinking of abolition, right? That there's a history that has always existed in abolition that's also a positive thinking and creation model, right? Even if we don't call it abolition, or even if it's not a part of like a political grounding or framework, abolition is about the creation of something that's not reliant on punishment. Abolition is about the creation of togetherness, of a world that is not built on anti-Blackness, but a world that's built on community. Abolition also requires you to dismantle and uproot what is actually embedded in white supremacy and misogyny and transphobia, right? And so it's a positive principle that exists in many different forms, and it is a political grounding and a political home. And so in 2020, we see, and I feel like a more intersectional embracing of abolition, and deepening this uprooting in a way that is a collective deepening and uprooting. And I think, you know, Monifa can speak more specifically to thinking about, like, you know, the defund movement, right? But this is a collective work with Movement for Black Lives that comes from many different ecosystems to not just uproot a carceral system that is confined in our imagination only to be police, but expanding our positive thinking of this is a policing world that we live in. And so the framework of abolition also must continue to be an expansive political home.
I think that was right on. And I just want to add to what one of the things you said that stuck out to me, Nyoka, is that it's actually not so many years ago. So yes, what Erin said, which is that not so many generations ago, I mean, because yes, what Erin said is that this is a continuation. And I recall recently being in a presentation where, you know, people were made to think about the oldest member in your family, you know, and some of us have, you know, got folks that's in their 90s or whatever. Now, when they were children, the oldest members of their families more than likely had experienced child slavery. Like, you're talking about a beat away. So yes, this is a continuation. You know, abolition is a movement that is connected back hundreds of years, you know, multiple generations. But when you think about it, over the course of the time that Africans have been in the Americas, is actually the blink of an eye. So I just wanted to add that to Erin, you know, because we're building on some very powerful work, and people will have us believe that this is some old issue, but it's really not.
Right on, and thank you for that. Zach and Ashley, do you want to respond?
Sure. First of all, I'm just humbled to be on this panel with all of y'all brilliant Black women. It is fitting because Black women have been leaders in the movement for abolition, from Harriet Tubman to Angela Davis, Mariam Kaba. So it's humbling to be on the panel, and I appreciate the invitation. It's also an honor to be the executive director of an organization that is named after Ella Baker, who was a brilliant Black woman, a leader in decades of struggle, and believed in the power of everyday people to make change. And what I want to say is a little bit more personal, because I think for me, the road to abolition has also been a personal journey. I was born in San Francisco, but we moved to Oakland when I was a week old, and I like to say it was a week too late because I really love Oakland that much. My mother is a white elementary school teacher. My father is a Black former shipyard worker, now janitor. And, you know, I think we are born free, but we're born into a society that is governed by fear. We're born into a society where 53 cents of every federal dollar goes to the military. In California, 23 new prisons built in just one new university from 1980 to 2000. The lion's share of resources go to police departments rather than actually supporting people being able to live and thrive. And these systems really accelerate the morbidity and mortality of Black people in particular. And I'm talking about policing and punishment in prisons, but also the lack of resources, as Dr. Reverend William Barber talks about, like the death measures on the down low, right? When we don't have food in our homes, 700 people a day will die from hunger. 1,800 people will, or maybe it's more than that, will die as a result of not having health care, right? And so I have said, like, the ethos of this country was founded on the idea that, like, the expansion, the westward expansion of this country was partly founded on this idea that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, right? But we like to think, like, in the context of slavery, in the context of genocide, that those are things in the past. But I think that our governance over the past 40 years, their philosophy and ethos has been the only good government is a death government. Because when you will only fund or almost exclusively fund policing and prisons, you are setting people up for failure. And policing and prisons and punishment have been recession-proof. Meanwhile, all of the things that actually help sustain true safety and true opportunity have been slashed and burned. Now, I wasn't thinking about that, like, growing up. I was, you know, just one of the good kids, right? I went to a predominantly Black Catholic school, light-skinned African-American, did well in school. They gave me a lot of awards in 8th grade. It was like Oscars so white, 8th grade graduation so Zach. Like it was unjust. And I didn't think about that as an 8th grader, but when I got to Harvard, I started to see how young people were treated differently, often for doing some of the same things that my former classmates, family, and friends were doing and getting locked up for. So for me, as I've come to reflect on it, abolition is also about the common sense that recognizing that those students at Harvard who got mental health counseling, who got time off, who got drug treatment and support, who were treated as more than their worst mistake, that should be available to everyone, because that's what actually helps people survive and thrive. So I could say more, but I want to be conscious of not taking up too much space. So I'm going to stop there.
I'll just jump in really briefly. Again, I also feel very grateful to be in this conversation with each of you. When I think about abolition, or I've been in the process of trying to explain it to maybe older members of my family, I think the work for me has really consisted of not being in my bubble with very socially conscious folk, but also like the aunties, the church members, the folks who are really struggling right now, but feel deeply connected. And I think the reason they feel deeply connected in my life, the older Black women, the older Black folk in my life, is because they know something's not right. You know, they have a very intrinsic feeling of the ways that the structures that are set up in our country and in our world are set up against Black people. And with that, there's an openness. And so when I've been trying to talk about this, I'm really glad, Monifa, that you talked about enslavement, because I think for me, that's very accurate. The oldest living member of my family, who I can still talk to and who uses email, she, first of all, her father was murdered by white people in Alabama for running a business. And beyond that, her grandparents were enslaved people. So this is not like an abstraction. This is an actual real thing that runs through my bones and my body. And I understand that abolition is the work that we're talking about right now. Abolition in the context of the prison industrial complex is an extension of that same system of chattel enslavement. We understand that many of the structures that are harming Black children now are structures that were created in large part in response to the freedom of formerly enslaved people. So policing, understanding that for a lot of us in the Northeast where I grew up, it came about to control labor movement, to control unions, and then also to catch people who were escaping enslavement. And so when I think about abolition, I think about it as a continuing struggle to dismantle those structures that from the very beginning were intended to control Indigenous people, to kill Indigenous people and steal land that had belonged to them for centuries and millennia, and to control the uprisings of poor people, and to control Black bodies. And so as we're working to dismantle those structures, we're doing what Erin talked about, imagining something different, but also scaling the things that already existed in many of our communities that were healing and that were helpful for us, but making more space for that. So I think that there's a connection between an anti-capitalist analysis, and I'm going to try not to use a lot of academic words on this conversation, but really just talk about like what we live through in the day-to-day and how that connects to abolition. Most of us, if you have children or if you were a child, you send your kids to a school, a place that is often a place of indoctrination, and schools also teach us some of the same fear, they teach us some of the same anti-Blackness, and they teach us some of the same harmful ideology that is enslavement and that is also carceral. And so as we're working towards abolition, we're working to dismantle those same punitive thought processes and create space for people to be free, to be themselves, to feel cared for and loved. And that is helping us get to where we want to be.
Thank you for that, Ashley. And that's right on. So a lot of what I'm hearing is like, this is really, you know, when we talk about abolition today, we're talking about a continuum of struggle, particularly a continuum of struggle of BIPOC people in this country, of Black, Indigenous people of color in the United States of America, right? We're talking about dismantling punitive systems that we know are inherently anti-Black in its root because they were created, right, in response to chattel slavery. They were created in response to the organizing of unions, as Ashley mentioned. And so thank you for sharing that. I think it's important for us as we continue to have this conversation, as the defund the police movement grows, and as we all continue to learn, that we are able to make this conversation on abolition, that we're able to make it plain and really make it connect for folks. And so I also really appreciate it when Monifa mentioned, you know, we're not that far off, right, from the abolition of slavery, and really reminding us about that context. Like, we're not that far off. We're just a couple of generations away. So thank you for that. The next question I wanted to ask you all, and if everyone can also respond to this, can you share how abolition shows up in your work and why you believe it's necessary? And I know you all are approaching this from really different sectors, which is what makes this conversation so interesting and so juicy to me in particular. So if you could, I would love for you all to just really go there. Tell us how it shows up and why now? Why is it necessary?
Sure, I'll jump in. And as I talk later on about the Breathe Act, how it shows up in my work and in the work of the Movement for Black Lives right now is like multifaceted, because one of the things that I wanted to let folks know is that the Movement for Black Lives is actually an ecosystem of over 150 Black-led organizations that includes GGE, that includes Movement for Family Power. And so we're working on abolition from many different angles. But with my home organization, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, one of the ways that we're really pulling that lever is on defund the police, right? Looking specifically at policing, tying the work that we've done for 2 decades about abusive policing in different cities across the country to this current moment, calling for there to be a completely drastic reimagining of what public safety looks like. So that's our specific lever, is policing.
I'll just jump in here. So for Girls for Gender Equity, our lever is an expansion. It includes policing and work to end the criminalization of young people through the juvenile legal system. One of the main things that we're working on right now is, of course, the police-free schools movement. And so this movement is not new to GGE. It's existed for quite some time. We've done some research and found that there were students who organized in 1968 in New York to try to address the carceral practices that were happening in New York City schools way back in 1968. So for a long time, young people really have been organizing to say that the largest school district in the country, New York City, needs not have police in schools, and that actually the resources that go toward policing in New York City are actually resources that are not going into classrooms, not going towards teachers. And in this moment, this pandemic, those are resources that are not going towards nurses. In New York City, as we speak, when schools were open a week or so ago, the school safety agents, which are just school cops, were taking the forehead temperatures of students when they came into the building because there weren't enough nurses. And so it's a reflection of obviously the priorities of the city and the priorities of our culture. And so our work at GGE is to really, build the political education and the analysis so that there's more buy-in around police-free schools, so that educators, principals, parents who maybe are not as familiar or who are not as politicized around this issue can understand why it's so important, and also understand how their children, particularly Black and Indigenous young people, are being harmed by the presence of policing. And then also approaching this through an analysis around gender-based violence. We know that it's not a common conversation, but police are often purveyors of sexual violence, not just in the streets and in communities, but also in schools. Quiet as it's kept, it is actually a common practice for young girls to describe being sexually harassed by the cops in their schools. And so what we're trying to do is make a commitment to divesting the money, the $451 million, you heard me, $451 million that goes to the school cops, just the school cops in New York City, and reinvesting that money into classrooms and to things that young people believe would be helpful for them. And so that is what the work looks like. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about it later in our conversation.
For us at the Ella Baker Center, we were founded in 1996, and a lot of our work grew out of challenging state violence and police violence. And we have worked to close youth prisons. We have worked also to build out the vision of community safety that is actually grounded in the dreams and aspirations of formerly incarcerated folks, currently incarcerated folks, their family members, survivors of crime. We did a report called Who Pays the True Cost of Incarceration with Forward Together and 20 other community-based organizations across the country. And folks really lifted up wanting to have economic opportunity and restorative and transformative justice and being able to stay in their homes as important to community safety. So we tried to create that in a physical space called Restore Oakland, which opened in 2019. And the last thing I'll say is we have been, ever since the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, a self-proclaimed neighborhood watch captain, we have been helping to convene Night Out for Safety and Liberation, which happens every first Tuesday in August. It's kind of a remix of National Night Out. National Night Out, doesn't have a bad spirit. It's community members coming together to reclaim safety. But what has happened is the police have driven that narrative to say, you're the eyes and ears of the police. If you see something, say something, which really can drive murder, as we saw with Trayvon Martin. And so we have really tried to put forward a different vision of what safety looks like collectively with a number of different organizations across the country that have participated in Night Out for Safety and Liberation. And I think it's that sort of like long-term vision, but also what's the day-to-day practice that we're trying to push forward so that neighbors can be seeing each other, so that, folks recognize that offering a young person mentorship is creating community safety, offering a formerly incarcerated person a job is creating community safety, us looking after one another, the work of like women of color against violence and harm-free zones, all of that work is really truly creating safety. And so lifting up some of those examples and some of the intersections around the ways in which marginalized folks based on gender, based on race, based on class, have not seen themselves in a vision of safety that is fundamentally unsafe for us, that is driven by policing in prisons. And so that's the goal behind Night Out for Safety and Liberation.
I'm gonna get kind of more in detail a little bit later, I think, but I think it's important for me to also simply say to your question, how abolition shows up in our work is it is a political home. And I think that is really relevant when you're talking about child welfare. For funded organizers and activists in this space, which is very few funded organizers and activists, the ability to say, I have a political home in abolition to the foster care system feels very unsafe. And for our work, saying that this is not a system that keeps us safe, doesn't keep our family safe or our children safe, that is how abolition shows up in our work. From that political grounding, yes, we have programs, we have offerings, we have, building of political education, but it's also about being in conversation even with our comrades, right? I think for many people, the framework of abolition has sat very squarely within the confines of the physical building of a cage, and then potentially in the physical bodies of an actual police officer, right? In our work, we really try to say, policing is an ideology. And I think, Nyoka, you started off saying we have an addiction to punishment. An addiction to punishment doesn't live in the concrete walls of a cage. It doesn't live only in the badges of an NYPD or police officer, right? And it shows up in our work in that orientation and that kind of configuration to really pushing intersectionality within the system.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that, right? Because abolition is a political home and it is a political framework, right? And so it is, you hit it right on the head, Erin, because it is about more than just alternatives to incarceration, right? It is about more than just defunding the police. And that's why this particular conversation is so important, because we know not only is abolition cross-sectoral, but it's also intersectional, right? And it shows up in so many aspects of our lives that we're almost unconscious to it in the many ways that it shows up, right? And so I would love to turn back to you, Erin. I want you to take us to school, because I think it's important. You know, we open up the conversation by, you know, diving a little bit into how folks understand the historical context of abolition and its relation to slavery. And so I would love for you to just talk us through, you know, the historical harms that have been caused in the child welfare system and where those roots were developed. So I'm gonna turn it to you so that you can just school us and really just walk us through the many ways and just how, you know, just how insidious punishment is.
So I'm gonna have a slideshow, and I love it. Take your school. You know, before I did this work, I was a middle school teacher, so I got this. I'm gonna put this through. You can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to say before I start this that I don't come with this information as this enlightened individual. There are many. You can start clicking through activists and organizers that have been resisting the foster system that you see in New York City's Black Families Matters. You see in California Families Rise, Starting Over Inc. In Philly, you have DHS Give Us Back Our Children. This is a long legacy of activism that I'm gonna try to summarize in a few slides with you all. You can go to the next slide. And what I'm really going to try to say is that we have a problem. We have a problem in the United States. We have child services has encroached upon the lives of many American families. And let's just think about it. Over 1/3 of American children and half of Black children, 50% of Black children have been subject to investigations. And I think this is really important to understand this statistic here, because when we talk about the investigation of Black children through child services, that is the investigation of a Black family. And so it's coming in through, you know, the criminalization of motherhood, the criminalization of parenting, but then you're bringing in over half of Black children. And I think that just when you're talking about a political home and a political theory around this issue, you have to really make a decision that it is either the case that over half of Black children and their families are just bad and deserve this investigation, and this is a system that is working well, or we have some serious racism and structural issues that are happening. These numbers can't comport and say that this is a good system, but it's okay and everyone's deserving of the system, right? Go to the next slide. And so when we look at, I think you were talking about oppression being recession proof, what we know is that from 1982 to 2003, federal funding for removing children has increased by 20,000%, right? So then we think about that initial problem. 50% of Black children and their families are being investigated. And since 1982, 20,000% increase, $5 billion increase to money from the federal government for removal, right? At the same time in 1982 to 2003 that we've divested from welfare, we've divested from community-based supports. We've done an extraordinary divestment from healthcare, divestment from Medicaid. Go to the next slide. And we know from the history of our Black feminists that this is a part of our theory of abolition, that we cannot just abolish police in cages and pretend that we're finished everything, right? Like there's a reason why we have that large number of children and families under investigation. There's a reason why we are funding in such a high disproportionate mechanism to out-of-home removals and our child welfare system. And we need to get to that reason, right? You can go to the next slide. And when we get to that reason, we have to go back. So we have to go back to why. Why are we in this place where we are over-investigating Black families, where we are removing Black children? Why are we in this place where we feel more comfortable dumping money into our child services and child welfare systems than we are in putting cash in the hands of Black mothers? And that really goes down to the history of chattel slavery in the United States. The history of chattel slavery in the United States is one that is fundamentally about family separation. It's about controlling the reproductive capacity of Black birthing people. It's about creating science and history and propaganda to state that Black parents are less worthy, less deserving. And that was done very intentionally to create a system that allowed capitalism to flourish in the United States. And so anytime you see an overrepresentation or a system that is built upon family separation and then primarily targets Black and brown families, you must wonder, what are these roots, right? Or you're on that 50% that says this is a functioning system and people deserve it, right? So go to the next slide. So then when we understand the actual history of child welfare, it then becomes very clear that yes, in fact, this is a part of our oppressive lens in the United States. And who we have here is a white Protestant male, Charles Loring Brace, who's considered to be one of the founders of our modern foster system. And what he did is that he was the founder of the Children's Aid Society. And he started what is known as the orphan train. And they literally went in to immigrant neighborhoods and said, we need to save these children from their parents, that these are the dangerous classes. This is children who at that point in time were not racialized as white, were considered to be the dangerous classes. And the only way to save them, these child savers believed, was separation, moving to live with Protestant families and giving them nominal wages to work for white families. This happened right about 10 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation being signed. So in a world where chattel slavery was still legal, this is how this system was actually created. Move to the next slide. And if that's not enough to get you saying like, yes, this is like fundamentally rooted in oppression, we know that Indigenous children were taken through the foster system. They were taken from their parents by the thousands, to the point that places like South Dakota, Indigenous children are still 12 times more likely to be removed from their family. And the intergenerational harm of removal was captured and implemented through the very system that we currently rely on to say is safety and protective of children. And this wasn't, a year ago or 5 years ago. We have people still living from these places where children were raised in institutions and told that they quote unquote had to tame the savage from the Indian. Next slide. And even today, we're seeing people with disabilities still be primarily separated from their families. We still have 2/3 of states where a parent's disability is the sole legal basis to permanently sever the parent-child relationship. Again, this relates to our history of eugenics, our history of chattel slavery, our history of creating deserving versus undeserving caretakers that's not actually based on reality. Next slide. And, I'm going through a history lesson of 200 years within about 7 minutes. We now also see how the war on drugs played in that part. So we talked about this 50%, right? We talked about 50% of Black children have been subject to investigations. We have to understand that this is not the one system that is the one good system. We want to believe that. Many people want to say, well, this is the one system that's getting it right. And what I tell people is, one of the biggest changes in our modern day history of child services happened in 1997. As for the Adoption Safe Families Act, fundamentally changed how we process and think about terminations of parental rights, the reasonable efforts that foster care agencies have to make to reunify, and even the very things that are considered to be efforts to reunify children with their parents. It happened at a time where nearly 50% of the children in the system were Black. And it happened with the very same people and implemented by the very same lawmakers who implemented the Violent Crime and Law Enforcement Act, who gutted welfare in 1996, who were a part of, the Just Say No campaigns. It is not possible. It is unbelievable. And it is in fact naive to believe these very same people who are inflicting highly, highly punitive laws in every other system got it right with this one system. Next slide. And so it makes sense, right? If you're looking now in 2003 back from, if we tail end this idea that instead of investing in welfare, instead of investing in housing, instead of investing in just Black people, right? Our visions of our families, that we dumped all that money into this system, which quite honestly, no one wants to put their children into. If foster care was a good thing, everyone would want to put their kids in there. No, it is not. It is a scary place for children. It's a scary place for parents. It's a scary place for families. And it's a connecting pipeline between almost all of our carceral systems. Next slide. And it's a relic. It is not a relic, but it is in fact the child of slavery, right? When you connect the history of forced sterilization, right, of Puerto Rican people, the understanding that we actually made specific efforts of eugenics to separate brown and Black people and to control their bodies, that's related to slavery. It's related to saying, you as a brown woman, you are not good enough, you are not enough, you do not have the capacity to make choices about your body and your children. And that makes us okay with policing brown women. When we talk about the war on drugs, it makes us okay because we said the worst threat was the mom herself. We didn't treat people with kindness. When we look at what we said welfare queens were, we said, you know what? We're not going to give you money. We're going to give it to foster parents. All those things created this idea that caretaking, if you are Black or brown, deserves less. And it's important to understand that as a connection to youth, because we want youth to grow up into a world where they can be adults, right? That's the idea. We want to live. And if you are living, we want you to, if you choose to be a parent, right? If at 16 you are a parent, if it's 24 you're a parent, if that's 35 you're a parent. We want to grow we want to grow into a world that says, we will love you as a mother, as much as we love you as a child. And we will not create a system that is built on separation to be the main place where funding is for your community. Next slide. So there's a couple ideas, right? Like, we can't continue doing this anymore. We need to divest. Next slide. We need to increase social safety nets. Next slide. And the work that we're doing is reimagining what we actually need, envisioning together. And so since 2019, our organization has been convening bi-monthly calls with activists and doulas and midwives and practitioners to be like, what is it that we actually want? What are we demanding? And the things that people are asking for, when we're saying we want to abolish the foster system, it's not scary. What we're asking for is family autonomy, baby boxes, mental health support, resources. We're asking for these things without the threat of punishment, without the threat of family dissolution. Next slide. And that's what abolition is, right? Like, abolition are all those ideas. So I hope that was like a quick school history lesson. Got about 200 years in there very quickly.
Thank you so much for that, Erin. That was super informative, and really, it's brilliant because it draws the line. It draws the line, and part of how white supremacy functions, right, and anti-Blackness functions is to like cause confusion and cause disconnect, so that we're not always able to draw the thread of how this carceral system in all its many ways play out in all of the systems that we interact with. So thank you for very clearly and very plainly drawing the line of 200 years of history that got us to where we are today. Brilliant presentation. And as I mentioned, because this work is intersectional, I want to turn to Ashley, if I can. Girls for Gender Equity is involved in a number of campaigns, including Police Free Schools, which you mentioned, and you all have been organizing for such a long time. Part of GGE's core organizing frame is anti-carceral feminism. Can you explain what anti-carceral feminism is and how anti-carceral feminism shapes the work at GGE?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I guess it would be a good time to hop into the slides. And I'll wait until the slides are up, and then I'll kind of breeze through a basic understanding. So we can just skip through this slide. I had some introduction, but at the most basic level, and I'm just gonna quote Victoria Law, Vicky Law, who's done a lot of research and writing about anti-carceral feminism, among other folks, but thinking first about carceral feminism. Carceral feminism is the description of an approach that sees increased policing, prisons, prosecution, imprisonment as the primary solution to violence against women. So we all know, or many of us know, that in the 60s and 70s, there was a whole movement that people call the Battered Women's Movement, where women, mostly white middle-class women, but also a large group of working class. At the time, they, called themselves third world women, we're saying we have experiencing interpersonal violence, gender-based violence in our homes and our communities, and we've had enough. And unfortunately, at that time, that movement looked to government to take action in order to create safety for them, but they unfortunately made a commitment to investing in the prison industrial complex as a tool for safety. But we know that that just does not work. And we also know that that approach ignored the fact that there were also people coming up alongside that same movement who did have a different framework and who were really critiquing capitalism and other structures that they believed created the violence that they were seeing in their homes and in their communities. And so those folks we think of as the anti-carceral feminists. Anti-carceral feminism is a belief that we can end gender-based violence and we can create safety and healing and well-being for women, trans people, non-binary people, and that can only happen through the abolition of policing and prisons, and recognizing that police and prisons are actually sites of violence, and that they are constantly purveyors of sexual violence. In the school context, GGE has been doing work for a long time to address the issue of school-based sexual harassment. And so this is something that many Black girls and girls of color and young people have said that they've experienced, but they've experienced it so often that it is normalized. So when I was growing up, it was, grabbing girls and popping their bra straps. The young people now talk about a game called booty tag, and the young people run around and grab people's bodies. And it is a part of our culture. And our belief is that we are not going to end that type of violence. We're not going to end child sexual abuse or sexual violence more generally through prisons and policing. We are going to have to do the work to shift our culture and our mindsets. And we have to acknowledge the ways that policing and prisons actually never create safety when we're talking about Black women and girls. And actually, we are more likely to see a Black woman or a Black girl or a trans person who says, who comes forward and says that they've experienced violence. That person is more likely to be criminalized than they are to be protected from the system. We also know that policing drains schools and city budgets. So when we're trying to do the work, and there are educators and parents and community members who want to do the work to shift the way young people think about interpersonal violence, to create safety and healing, to invest in comprehensive sexual health education, we know that those resources are just not available. And every school district across the country has probably said at some point or another, we don't have enough. You always hear schools saying, we don't have enough for X, Y, or Z. And we like to say that you don't have enough because you have spent all of your money on trying to control young people through policing and prisons. We can go to the next slide. So this is just a map that you can find on GGE's website. I want to give a shout out to Rai, one of our policy interns who created this interactive map, and I can drop a link in the chat in a minute, but it basically, you can click on different incidents, and I do want to give a content warning because it is violent, but you can click on different incidents where girls of color, mostly Black girls, were assaulted by school police officers. One of the most famous or most well-known incidents was in 2015. A school cop was called in by a teacher, so that's a point that we have to keep making, and he threw a young 14-year-old girl to the ground in the most violent manner in front of her peers. And she was the one who was criminalized as a result. She was criminalized as well as the other students who filmed that incident. But if you look to this map, you'll see over and over again that Black girls and girls of color and trans young people are not being protected by school police. They're actually being assaulted and harmed by school police. And we have to recognize that there's also a factor playing in where even when a school doesn't have its own police department or school safety officer or school resource officer, we also know that teachers and educators often pick up the phone and invite these carceral players into their classrooms and into their schools. And we have to unpack what that is about. And we see that that happens primarily in Black schools. And so Erin talked about control, and we have to think about why people feel like they have to constantly control Black young people and Black bodies. We can skip to the next slide. So really simple, this is sort of what I was touching on before, but anti-Blackness is inherent to policing. They cannot be separated. We cannot have more Black school cops or more Indigenous people of color as school police officers and think that that will undo a system that is inherently built on control and surveillance. And we also have to think about the ways that the practices that schools use, even before they've ever called a police officer, are carceral practices. So something like an expulsion or suspension where you remove someone and say that you are not welcome here, that is a carceral practice. And we recognize that those carceral practices disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous girls and non-binary youth. And we think about, there are thought processes that we have. So even before we think about putting a young person in a juvenile justice facility, what they call them, I call them juvenile prisons. Even before we get to that point, there are ideologies that we hold about having to control people. I always give the story or the anecdote because it still gives me chills of 4 girls of color, young girls who were in Binghamton, New York in January in 2019, so just a year, almost 2 years ago now, who were strip searched by their assistant principal and school nurse because they were giggling too much. Most of you probably heard that story, but underneath that story, there's also a conversation to be had about control. The assistant principal and the nurse thought these Black girls, these girls could not be this happy or gleeful or giddy unless they were using drugs. And so there was a belief that we have to control them. And so they had these young people, they were 11 years old, strip searched at school. And so those are carceral practices, and those practices create what folks know as school push out or the school to prison pipeline, but they are part of a continuum that is a part of the prison industrial complex, but it begins pretty much at birth, and it certainly is reinforced in our American public school system. And we understand that if we believe that the system is inherently anti-Black, it cannot be used to protect young people, and it cannot be used to protect survivors. We can go to the next slide. So just really briefly, I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Charlotte Pope, who has been doing phenomenal research for our team and just crunching numbers about what's been happening. So in this year, as a result of activists taking to the street to say defund the police, we were able to get more data about incidents where New York City Police Department officers had harmed young people and all sorts of people. And Charlotte crunched this data set specifically about incidents where girls under the age of 24 were harmed by school cops, and these are police. And these are just the numbers of girls under the age of 24 harmed by police. These are just the numbers that were substantiated. So we want to name it. There are many incidents where young people have come forward and nothing ever happens. It does not get recorded, and it doesn't get to the point of a hearing or an investigation or substantiated. So I just want to continue to name that. Just because something isn't substantiated does not mean that it didn't happen. But 60% of the young people the girls, and I'm saying girls, but I know many of them may not have even identified as girls, but the young people who were harmed by police in New York City were Black. And so this is not a system that is helpful or creates safety. It is a system that is inherently Black. Unless you believe that Black children are just more violent or more dangerous, then you have to recognize that this system is structured to follow them and to surveil them. The report that we put up that's on the GGE website includes a Black girl as young as 8 who experienced violence at the hands of a substantiated complaint of violence against the NYPD, and she was 8 years old. Next slide. Really quickly, when we talk about the context of school-based gender-based violence, we have to think about prevention. What we should be working towards is making sure that young people have a really clear understanding of healthy relationships, a clear understanding of consent, and that is actually how we prevent sexual harassment and assault. There is no research showing that school police protect young people. In fact, the research says the opposite. There is research showing that if young people from K to 12 get age-appropriate comprehensive sexual health education, they are less likely to engage in sexual harassment or assault, and they're less likely to experience it. So when we try to build cultures of consent, that is the work, but unfortunately there's no money for that or very little resources for that because we've invested all of our resources as cities and states into punishment and into carceral systems. We understand that young people are receiving messages constantly. I even put the highest levels of government, they're receiving messages constantly that sexual violence is normal and trivial. So you cannot undo that message through expulsions or through suspensions or through carceral practices. Next slide. This is just a look at the work that we've done this year on this issue. The bit.ly to the right, bit.ly all caps PFS GGE. That's our Police Free Schools Toolkit. We created that toolkit, and not me, my colleagues created that toolkit specifically for educators and school administrators, because we understand that sometimes advocates are having conversations with ourselves and not necessarily with the people who have the ability to shift the conditions in schools. And so these are tools, it's over 100 pages of actual interactive tools that they can do to create the conditions for police free schools. But then I also want us to look at the money, because I can't emphasize this enough. You know, people use that phrase, where your treasure is, there your heart lies. In New York City, the largest school district in the country, we have invested, as Manuela said, almost $500 million in just the school police, That's not even the whole NYPD 6 billion. This amount of money, if we redistributed, that means an additional 282,000 per year to all of the public schools in New York City. So if we had that money, we can only imagine how we can build cultures of consent. We can only imagine what we could create. And I really want to emphasize the ways that restorative justice or restorative practices are completely underfunded. It's less than $2 million in New York City school budget, or New York City's budget. And so we understand that this is something that we have divested from already. We've already divested from the education system. We've already defunded the education structures, or defunded DOE. And we have to do the work to move away from policing in schools, move away from trying to control young people and their bodies, and recognize that if we're doing work that is abolitionist work, that means we cannot support suspensions and expulsions. We cannot support police in schools under any circumstances. And I think sometimes as advocates, we get into the business of, well, what about those really, really bad kids, or those really bad incidents? Or for people who grew up in New York or in other cities in the 80s and 90s, there is a fear about what schools look like then. And we have to recognize that some of the harm and violence that people experience is largely attached to the defunding of education and the ways in which young people were not being invested in. And the next slide is just a list of resources, but we don't have to talk about that. I'm happy to share my reading list any other time. We can X out of the slides. Hopefully that was a pretty clear understanding of anti-carceral feminism and the way that it intersects with the work to remove police from schools.
Yes, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Ashley, and really talking about the ways that, like, how do we counter carceral feminism, right? And so how do we hold our communities as whole? And this is really what we're talking about. How do we hold our communities as whole? Erin opened up by talking about the womb to prison pipeline, essentially. Ashley comes into the conversation talking about how there's like a heightened state of surveillance and policing once young people enter public schools. I'm gonna turn to Monifa right now, because the movement for Black Lives is really the ecosystem that largely holds the abolition work, right? M4BL is the ecosystem that kind of holds all the various intersectional pieces of this. And so M4BL has worked on the Breathe Act. So the Breathe Act is being heralded as this generation's Civil Rights Act. So Monifa, I would love if you could talk us through high level, what are some of the high level policy changes that the Breathe Act calls for?
Thank you so much. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I did it. Thank you. Yeah, all of this activism works together in this huge labyrinth, and we are going to get free. And so I'm just excited. I'm just amped, you know. Ashley and Erin's work fits very closely with our movement to defund the police. So first of all, I just want to shout out what the Movement for Black Lives is. Again, it's 150 member coalition of Black-led organizations. And this summer, we put 25 million folks on the street under the banner of Defund the Police. And right under that, wherever you saw that, whether it was online or in the streets, we talked about investing in Black communities. And Ashley and Erin already laid it out. You know, like everything else has been defunded and everyone has been cool with that, right? So instead of supporting families, children are removed because families don't have heat and hot water, which is one of the reasons why sometimes people's children are removed. Instead of investing in schools, you know, police are flooded in. And so our invest, divest model just talks about actually investing in real health and safety. We do want to be safe. a lot of the backlash that we've seen over the last couple of days of defund the police is like, oh, people don't, y'all want to be safe. You want to just let people be victims to violence. No, what we're saying is that we actually want everyone to be safe, right? And not just those who the police protect. There's an excellent toolkit. I'm gonna drop a link in the chat box when I'm done speaking. That's called Interrupting Criminalization. I think this was also on one of Erin's slides. It was also recently updated. But also people are coming at us saying that it's too complicated. I don't understand it. This is a very easy toolkit to follow. There are graphic presentations in there. There's a video. There's so many ways that you can share this with your faith community, with your school, with your tenants association, to really kind of unpack why we're addicted to punishment, as Nyoka said, to really kind of remove the propaganda that we've been indoctrinated for so many years, not just in the education system, like how Ashley named, but through Hollywood. You can't turn on the TV and not be met with police propaganda, right? You cannot go to your great auntie or your grandmother's house and not see Law and Order playing on at least one of the screens, right? Or Judge Judy or what have you. And all of this is part of why people can't kind of imagine what public safety looks like without police. We didn't just begin talking about defund the police in the summer of 2020, right? The movement for Black Lives, which emerged out of the Ferguson uprising 6 years ago, has organizations that are new and organizations that have been around for decades calling for an end to police violence. And the reason why we say defund the police in the summer of 2020 is because we know for a fact that these incremental reforms on policing never have the outcomes that we desire. So one example that I love to highlight is that a big lever in the congressional policing bill this summer was a ban on chokeholds. Well, cities and states all over the country have banned chokeholds, for decades. In fact, for the NYPD, chokeholds have been banned since 1993. But since that time, countless people have been strangled to death by the police. Some folks know about Anthony Baez. Everybody knows about Eric Garner. Police departments with their outsized budgets and their outsized political power fly above these incremental policy changes in a way that does not stop the killing of Black people. What are some of the other things that we have tried over the past 2 decades? Because I want people to understand, again, this didn't just drop out of the sky this summer, right? In the intro, Nyoka mentioned some of these pieces of litigation, right? So I'm gonna take it back. I'm gonna take it all the way back to Amadou Diallo, who was shot 41 times by the NYPD in February of 1999. And in the wake of that emerged a coalition called People's Justice 2000. And we had a multi-layered approach to try to figure out how we gonna stop Black people from dying at the hands of the police. And we had some of the levers that you see being discussed today through Congress's bill, Justice and Policing, right? So one, we wanted to get the data and shut down the street crimes unit. So we successfully launched and won a piece of litigation called Daniels versus NYC, right? And Daniels basically helped to dismantle the actual unit, right, that killed Amadou Diallo. It was a street crimes unit, right? And we launched Cop Watch. The police tried to shut down Cop Watch. So we sued again with Bandele versus NYC, right? Protecting the right for us to monitor the police, right? So we're shutting down units that we know kill. We're making sure that we can watch the cops. And then another successful lawsuit was Floyd versus NYC, because we wanted to establish through the data that we collected from the outcome of Daniels, one of the remedies was to start to collect data on who was stopped and frisked in New York City. And then we use that data a decade later in the Floyd case to say, essentially, NYPD's practice of stop and frisk is unconstitutional. It's essentially racial profiling. We didn't have to say hypothetical, either you think that 80% of Black and brown men are more likely to be doing something illegal just when they're walking down the street. We had the data that said that this was not the case, that most of these stops were unsubstantiated, and there was huge racial disparities in these stops. So these pieces of litigation were won. We also passed legislation, right? People say, well, what we need to do is ban racial profiling. Did that. Racial profiling was already banned, then we strengthened it through the Community Safety Act. We need to make sure people have a right to refuse to be searched. Passed that. Consent to search, did that. And then a big one, especially about 7 years ago, was about special prosecutor. Everybody's talking about special prosecutor. I was talking about special prosecutor, right? It was all about the DAs, right? The DAs will not prosecute the police. They are basically one and the same. It's like the police policing themselves. And in New York City, we were able to push the governor to sign an executive order to establish an office of special prosecutor to hold police accountable. And guess what? The special prosecutor has been unable to hold police accountable, and New Yorkers continue to be killed at the hands of the police. So defund the police is built on deep knowledge and understanding of what we're up against, right? It is not a snappy slogan, as former President Barack Obama said yesterday in the Hill. It is a very strategic and intentional call to action. Ashley mentioned the NYPD budget, so I have to break it down. This is, of course, over 5 years, but in a single year, NYPD's budget is $6 billion plus. You got to add, if you add docs on it, it's more than that, right? It goes closer to $8 billion, and you compare that to everything else that we know keeps us safe. And here's the value statement of our city. What are some of the ways that we're fighting to defund the police, right? Because it's all these levers, right? So one is definitely what Ashley said, which is to get police out of schools, right? You can also, in your city, I know people are watching from all over the country, you can look at the academies and the hiring processes, right? You can freeze hiring on the police. You know, it's going to be really hard to kind of go in and just say you want to dismantle today or tomorrow. So here's some levers. You can say we want to stop the over-hiring into the police departments, cancel the cadet classes. And here's the piece that really is close to my heart, and I think especially folks who've been on the ground these past couple of months in Philly, which is to make sure that the police are not responding to non-police activities, right? There's been this like idea, you know, that everything is a nail because here they come with a hammer for everything that's happening in the community, right? And so often when our families call for care, when we need health care, when we need mental health services, you know, when we're feeling unsafe, when we're not sure about something that's happening, we don't have anything or anyone else to call but the police. Just a few months ago marked the 8th anniversary of the killing of Mohammed Ba, right here in New York, similar to Walter Wallace in Philadelphia. He was having an emotional health crisis and his mother called 911 for an ambulance. And before an ambulance got there, the NYPD came and they killed Mohammed Ba. And we know that's also the situation in Rochester with Daniel Prude. So this idea of expanding the police to do social services, homelessness outreach, responding to mental health, we have to pull all of that back. And in pulling all of that back, that also works in the interest of defunding the police. Abusive police, police who are on disciplinary administrative leave, many times receive their full salaries. An example is that the police officer who strangled to death Eric Garner, Daniel Pantaleo, it took 6 years to fire him. So in that time, New York City taxpayers spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on his salary where he wasn't working, right? So he had a paid 6-year vacation. And so again, there's also components of your police departments that are not police related. So when we opened up the NYPD budget, some of the things you'll find is like, we're paying for their PR, right? They got a whole comms department, right? That helps to spin the narratives against defund the police, and taxpayers pay for that. And there's other entities like that. And you can talk about the military equipment and all of the other surveillance mechanisms, and the list goes on and on and on and on. There was a news piece about the homeless surveillance apparatus of the NYPD. It is like something from the year 3030, right? It's cameras everywhere, following homeless people who are on the trains, on the streets, zooming in, zooming out, facial recognition, people sitting in some like CSI type office. And it's like, dude, you could like rent apartments. You could build housing for people who are homeless. This is ridiculous. This is why we say defund the police. I went through this list. I think if people always want to know what are some of the alternatives, I won't go in detail, but you can look, for example, at the campaign in Austin, Texas, which was pretty amazing. And they are specifically talking, they specifically redirected those funds into the agencies in the city that we know keep us safe and healthy. And that's the same thing we're fighting for here in New York City. We basically have no mental health infrastructure. You know, we basically have no infrastructure for the growing homelessness crisis. And so these are the ways that, these are the things that we want to fund that will keep us safe. And in addition to that, we're beginning to work in lockstep with community violence interrupters, right? So we have to think about all of the ways that we keep us safe and resource those things. Finally, I'm just going to quickly touch on the Breathe Act. I talked about the Vision for Black Lives, which is where we get our Invest, Divest model. It's a policy platform that was developed out of the Ferguson uprising. And then this summer, we created a piece of federal legislation that was inspired by Invest, Divest called the Breathe Act. And I'll drop the link in the chat because we've actually written this bill. It's 200 pages. You can check it out. You can share it. You can break it up. You can have teach-ins with it. But it looks at how not only are our carceral systems fueled right there in our local cities, we saw the budget for NYPD, but really wanting to dismantle it from the federal level down. And then I'll also drop the link to the actual Vision for Black Lives. And so last but not least, the Breathe Act has 4 sections in it, right? The first section is about divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing. That's going to be programs like the COPS program, which is billions of dollars. That's going to be all the carceral related components to the Burn Jag grants that go to states. Our states and cities are pumped with money from the federal government to fuel our incarceration and to fuel policing. The second section is about investment. And so we work with organizations all over the country to say, you know, what is it going to take to make you safe? And people said decarceration. So instead of incentivizing states to incarcerate, the Breathe Act proposes that we actually incentivize states and cities to reduce policing, to reduce incarceration. The third section is about building up new grants programs, right? So dismantling the grants that folks can get for incarceration and policing, and building up grants programs that are about health, that are about housing, that really help to sustain our communities and make them safe places. And last but not least, sometimes when we talk about defund, people think that that accountability doesn't factor in, right? No, we absolutely want to hold police accountable for killing our folks, but we're not just interested in the 1 or 2 police officers, we're interested in the entire departments that have a practice and pattern of killing our folks. We're talking about entire cities that use police forces to gentrify our communities. And so ultimately, we're talking about making sure accountability goes up just from the individual police officer up to the highest levels of decision-making and fuel our movement for reparations. So that is the Breathe Act in a nutshell. The biggest obstacle for us is the collective imagination of our people. Hollywood is something serious, you know. If you sit at the hairdresser and the TV's on, you're gonna see police propaganda, right? Like I said before, if you go to your auntie's house, and it's a lot, and some of it is shows we love, right? I'm gonna throw it out there. The Wire is police propaganda, right? We have to actually sit and think about when we were safe, when we felt the most safe in our lives. Was it in a police car? Was it at a precinct? Was it anywhere near a jail or prison? Where were we? Who was there? What did it feel like, look like, smell like? We want to invest in that.
Thank you so much, Monifa, for taking us through some of the specific details of what defund is calling for in this moment, for taking us through the historical examples of why, you know, for so long we have been caught up in reform. And so very early in your presentation, you named why reform can sometimes, it can be problematic, right? When there's no accountability behind it. When you talk about there's a chokehold that's been banned since 1993, and we still have people in New York City and in other places dying of chokeholds. We've also heard about, having police officers wear cameras on them, right? And so for a while, we were all on the camera bandwagon, and all it takes is the flip of a switch to turn off the camera, right? And then we don't know what happened. What we do know, we can assume based on the evidence that exists. I want to turn to Zach, because Zach, I would love for you to share, your work at the Ella Baker Center. You've been able to close a number of youth prisons. And in addition to that, you all have been able, when we talk about abolition, it's not only about abolishing harmful systems, but it's very much hand in hand with creating the systems, right? And creating the communities of care that are going to hold us. Right? Hold us as whole people that deserve love, that deserve care, that deserve our very basic human rights and human needs be met. So I'm going to turn it to you so that you can talk about Ella Baker Center's journey on closing youth prisons, and tell us a bit about Restore Oakland and what that space means for the local Bay Area.
Right on. Well, just so much wisdom coming from the panel. Just appreciate y'all so much. And Monifa, I also love The Wire. So I'm feeling that comment. And it's in line with just the fact that, what we're talking about is an economic journey. It's a political journey. It's a personal journey. There are a lot of different ways that we need to be divesting from what I call a framework of fear, right? That deprives folks of resources, that is based in suspicion of our families, that is based in the isolation of our family members and the punishment of our family members. And so, as Erin said, our families haven't been safe in this country, and we should be suspect, and we should question any system that is predicated on the separation of our families, be it immigration, be it child welfare, be it the criminal court system. As Sammy Nunez said one time to me, in his school setting, he knew that they were trying to identify all of those kids as either mad, bad, sad, or can't add, right? And there was a pathway into a different form of punitive system based on that oppression that was coming in his classroom in Gilroy. And, as I've talked about, I had a different level of privilege in my own journey. And so some of my unlearning of this framework of fear came after college. When I started, as Akala, the British rapper, talks about, taking a second set of notes and really trying to unlearn some of this framework of fear. And part of that journey for me was doing what the best organizers do, and that is listening to the people who are closer to the problem than I was. And for me, that was coming out of law school. I was charged with being an organizer of families of incarcerated youth. And I didn't have a real training or background in organizing, but I did have the good sense to listen. And these families were saying, we want to close these youth prisons down. That is our fundamental aim. These youth prisons need to be closed down. Our young people are being rearrested within 1 year of release. We're driving 250 miles on average just to see our kids, only to be told that we can't visit because we have on the wrong color pair of pants. So all of the stigma and the welfare queen mythology that Erin lifted up, and the super predator mythology that has been discussed in the context of the school system, was very much prevalent in terms of how these young Black people and brown people and their families were viewed by the state of California. And so we did what good organizers do. We got some t-shirts, right? Because you can't do good organizing without t-shirts. On the front, they said close CYA prisons. On the back, they said open youth opportunities. And this is at the turn of this century, in early 2000. So people laughed at us. They closed doors in our faces, but we kept building, we kept organizing. And over a near decade-long campaign in coalition with the Youth Justice Coalition, Labor Community Strategy Center, so many others, we were able to close down 5 of 8 youth prisons in the state of California. And there are some key lessons learned from that. One, fund organizing that is bold, right? I think you know, as Erin is talking about abolition of the child welfare system, that's at a stage that we were at in a different sense in terms of youth incarceration, right? So people should be funding that work that Erin is leading and others are leading now, understanding that folks will get there and the common sense will catch up, because our vision of humanity and who we are and that our families are sacred is undeniable, right? The other thing is that this wasn't just a win for human rights. That we closed these 5 youth prisons down. It was also a win for public safety, as Monifa and others lifted up, right? So youth crime continued to decline during that same period. And now guess what? The governor has a proposal to close the remaining 3 youth prisons. The California Alliance for Youth and Community Justice helped move that forward. So we're now looking at really ending our state-run youth prison system. And now some of the focus is on the local level and really helping to close down some of the probation camps in Los Angeles. Dignity and Power Now, Youth Justice Coalition, so many others are leading that work. We helped stop a youth probation camp from being built here in Alameda County. And part of what we're also now looking at is how do we build out the vision of what we want? How do we show what community safety really looks like? And so as I mentioned before, we did this report called Who Pays the True Cost of Incarceration on Families that really showed the impact of incarceration on Black women in particular, women of color, the economic impact, the social and emotional impact. It didn't really get a lot of play in terms of the solutions, though, that we were calling for in that report. And so what we try to do is create, and if you'll show the slide, you'll see a picture of Restore Oakland in the last slide. It's an 18,000 square foot building. Yeah, thank you. It's an 18,000 square foot building. It's a home to restorative and transformative justice. It is a home for economic opportunity, a home to Causa Justa Just Cause that is working to help keep people in their homes and fight the criminalization of homelessness and to fight for measures to pass rent control, among other measures. And so that work, to me, is about really demonstrating in the same way that we now have a more consensus around the need to divest from fossil fuels, right? People believe that we need a new energy infrastructure. And I think in the same way, we need visibilized examples of what this new community safety infrastructure looks like. Just as the environmental movement had solar panels and wind turbines and permaculture, we need buildings like Restore Oakland. We need the work of the violence interrupters that Monifa lifted up, like Devone Bogan, and the work of Advance Peace. You know, the incredible campaigns that are being moved forward across the country, both to get, you know, defund the police and prisons and child welfare system, but also to invest in the real community safety solutions that we need. So that to me is a huge advance in terms of our practice collectively to be able to show these models. And again, it comes out of a political journey, and I'll end here. Like, we had won a campaign in Alameda County to actually get Alameda County to not move all of its resources towards the probation department and the sheriff's department, about $10 million annually. But what did they do? They created these RFPs and these kind of long in the tooth nonprofit service providers who said they were going to create jobs, but really weren't, who said they had a connection to the community, but really didn't. The resources ended up going to other government agencies who fundamentally were still being governed by that same framework of fear. And so we built Restore Oakland as really a community-driven model of what safety looks like. And I think it's an example of this kind of complex, multifaceted way that we have to move our agenda that includes unlearning our own framework of fear, that includes a political journey, and also includes an economic journey in terms of shifting resources in the ways that we've described.
Right on. Thank you for that. And thank you for the work you've done on Restore Oakland. I mean, I think there's something very powerful in seeing a brick and mortar building that holds an alternative to what community care is, right? At the intersection of like repairing harm and economic justice and environmental justice. There's something really beautiful about that that I think makes it really tangible for folks. I want to open up, I want to go back to, I wanted to open up to the panelists. You know, we are in the space where we know abolition is not only about, you know, pulling apart these systems that are really harmful, but also creating the alternatives, creating a world that we want to live in that is more just and fair for us all, that censures those most harmed, that ensures that everyone has their needs met and are able to live healthy, whole, thriving lives. And so, Erin, I'm going to actually turn to you. If you can share a little bit about what is the world that you imagine? What does that world look like? And how can we support? How can we make that tangible? I want to lift up what Zach said about, you know, this abolition conversation in the child welfare space being very new, right? And so funders needing to fund bold ideas, right? And understanding that, you know, the conversation in abolition and child welfare is not necessarily on the same, on the same timeline as the defund the police conversation, but yet very necessary, very critical. I think what today's conversation showed us is how entangled these systems are, right? So I'm gonna stop there and let you respond. Please share with us your bold vision of what this world looks like where Black mothers and Black children are safe.
So, yeah, I've been really fortunate to be able to spend some time visioning actually recently. And this world looks like one that takes care of families. And that's both a bold and concrete idea. And so specific things that people are demanding when they're demanding the abolition of the foster system, I think people can think what we're saying also is we want housing. We actually want money to be able to raise our children. And more broadly, we want a care economy. We want a universal basic income, but we also want a care economy that actually gives money to caretakers. We want access to, you know, free, non-judgmental healthcare, one that is rooted not in anti-Blackness, but one that is rooted in care and support. We don't want mandated reporting that has not been shown to keep us safe. We want to be able to have private conversations with doctors and be able to go to places when we want treatment. We don't want therapists reporting on us. We want conversations. We want accountability when accountability is needed. We want to have the ability to seek accountability within our own communities. Right now, those things simply are not funded, they're not believed in, and we've come to this place in our imaginations that says, if you want to get rid of child welfare, then you must not want children to be safe. And I'm gonna tell you, as a Black woman, as a Black mother, the Black kids in a Black family, that is the most offensive idea to me, that any Black caretaker is out here saying we want to create no safety for our children, that we're the ones who want sexual assault in a system that is sexually assaulting our children. No, absolutely not. Like, we demand a world that our children are safe. This work is personal. Like, when I held my Black daughter in my arms when she was born, I realized there was nothing but abolition for us, because there was nothing in this world that would ever keep her safe. And we demand that, and that is our bold vision. And what Zach is saying, what everyone's saying is, like, we are in a different place. You know, you have to believe what people are saying, right? And I think it's important to think about, why are we in this place? When you think about a gender justice approach, you have to also say, like, that is something that has been oppressing caretaker voices, is a part of understanding the oppression of birthing in Black women and marginalized genders. There is a reason why we don't uplift caretakers. There's a reason why child welfare is not on the radar and in the same place. There's a reason why we don't want to fund those things, right? Those are things that are expressed on the bodies of Black birthing people, Black children, and Black families. That always is last on the list. And we're asking for it to be first, but we're asking for people to think about it and believe that we can get there.
Yeah, Thanks, Erin. My vision really is like family, you know. Um, I ended my presentation kind of actually alluding to an exercise that we do around Defund the Police, where we have teach-ins and we ask everyone to close their eyes and to imagine the time when they felt safe. Who was there? Where were they? You know, what did it look like? What did it feel like? And inevitably, it ties back to family security, family economic security, family health security, right? Even people who talked about homes and families not being safe and being a point of trauma in their lives, what they say is that when they felt most safe, though, was when the people in the family were well, when those people had what they needed to be their full selves, as opposed to falling victim to what those family members were doing that was causing harm. And so it is, I don't care what city, what community you go to, the separation of families, the war on families is one of the most destabilizing forces in our community. And if we build an economy of care, if we build a safety system around care, and people are allowed to exist within the safety of our families or our extended families, you know, sometimes it may not be mom and dad, maybe it's auntie, maybe it's grandma, but she has those resources, it makes a world of difference. And so, you know, I always love being on panels with Erin because she goes back to that separation of Black children and Indigenous children from their families, because not only is the family stability a safe place for us and a healthy place for us, it's the only way we can build power, right? So that's why our families are under attack, because if our families are whole and healthy, then stems from that is our political power, then stems from that is our economic power, stems from that, you know, is all of the power that we will build as a Black community to dismantle the capitalism that is disrupting us. And so that's why this core is so under attack. And that's why I named family and a safety in family as being the vision of what the future would look like, you know, if we were healthy and whole.
Thank you for that, Monifa. We're at about 3:45, so what I want to do is incorporate some of the questions we've been receiving into the conversation. So we have a question in the Q&A box that asks, how can we best bridge the gap between reformers and abolitionists? I think many reformers get to abolition eventually when they see the tweaks fail again and again. But have any of the panelists had success speeding the development of reformers towards abolition? So curious to hear I have some thoughts about that, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I have thoughts about this. Like, part of our orientation organizationally, the movement generation, they have a 3-circle framework that talks about what do we ultimately want, what's politically feasible in this moment, and then what's the opposition agenda. And we have often sort of targeted the intersection between what we ultimately want and what's politically feasible. And, you know, I think that there's a strength to that decision, but also there is a growth area around that. And I think that the clarity of just really stating what we ultimately want also moves people to what we ultimately want and need. And to me, it's not a either or. I think that we should both be speaking to what we want, but also be in the political practice of actually fighting to get that. And it's, you know, it is actually through some of those lessons learned, as Monifa described, like that organizationally was true for us too. Aaron Williams was a Black man who was killed in San Francisco. I won't go into the details of it, but we were successful early in the history of the Ella Baker Center in getting the officer fired, Officer Mark Andaya, in the 90s, at a time in which that was not happening by and large across the country. And yet it was, you know, you felt the absence of the victory because it was just a year or so later that another Black man was killed by the San Francisco Police Department. And so I think, you know, as an organizer, for me, it's a balance, because we do need to be engaged with where we are and be able to be in community with folks so that we can actually show victory towards the ultimate goal. So that's the kind of duality that that I see in response to that question.
Thank you for that, Zach. And so how do you hold the space between, I mean, I think that reform itself is very nuanced, because there are reforms that feed the state, right? And create further surveillance. So I think when I had mentioned the cameras, someone had put in the chat, the cameras are all, the body cameras are also used as another layer of surveillance of residents, right? So how do you distinguish like reforms that feed the state versus reforms that are leading us towards abolition? And what are some thoughts around that?
Oh, sorry, Monifa.
Oh, go ahead, Ashley.
I was just going to say, in the context of police-free schools, it's very similar to the context of like police in the community, police on the streets, but there's a lot of reform happening. There's a lot of tweaking. There's a lot of, if we train them better, because there is a need for adults in schools. And really that's what the research shows, right? Like schools actually, it's not that they want more cops, it's just they need more adults on hand to provide support and care for young people. And because we have divested from schools, it's so easy to be like, well, here's all these staff, why don't they fill in? And so many people are like, well, if we have this need, why don't we just train them? And so I think to the initial question was like, how do we move people? I think what we have to do is keep pointing out the ways in which harm and violence at the hands of police and in the context of school police, that it's not an exception and that it is actually pattern and practice, that it's not like, so the incident in Spring Valley, those are not one-offs, they're not exceptions, that's actually like how it works. And the more that I've been able to talk to people who are on the more reform side about that, the more concrete it became sort of to what Monifa presented about all of the reforms that we've tried and how it hasn't worked. And the other piece is like, how do we avoid those reformist reforms? I think we have to consistently acknowledge that some things that we may be invested in personally have caused harm in the past, other reforms that we've done. And so when we're really willing to be able to look at these things through honesty, then we're able to say, this did not work. This gave them a bigger budget. The trainings in particular, even scholars and people that I respect deeply have put out whole toolkits about how to train cops around girls of color. And that was extremely harmful. And we have to think about like, how do we move away from that training model and recognize that there are other practices that we could be doing that may not get us to their ultimate goal, but that reduce their budget. Those are just my direct experiences, but I'm sure there's so much more.
Thank you for that. We have about 10 minutes left on the call. And so one of the last questions, one of the questions that were posed, which align with one of the questions I already had, is like, what are some next steps? What are some next steps on the macro level, right? That abolition abolition as a political home, as a movement, should be taken over the next several years. And what are some next steps some of our participants can take as they leave this call? So what is our call to action, both collectively and individually? That's the question that I'm asking. And anyone and everyone can respond to that.
I think in a very like concrete space for child welfare, like if you're at a place to fund or give money, don't give it to the system. Stop doing it. I think then also fund, spaces for people to come together and vision and dream. And I also think if you are in a space where like you are funding infrastructure development to hold the capacity for all the brilliance and ideas that are percolating and available, right? I don't think that anyone asks anyone to go to a job in like a nonprofit industrial complex with like a program officer and no administrative support, HR, right? But that's kind of how funding is. Like we want to fund a program, but like nothing around the program that holds the capacity to keep it like anti-oppressive, slow it down, be in the space of movement, right? So that's a very concrete like next step if that's in the wheelhouse that you're in. I also think that I always think like education and getting political education is a really important step. So there's been so many resources put in the chat here that people should just read and dig into, question, like email people. I mean, you're welcome to email me if you have questions, right? I think part of why we repeat reforms is sometimes we don't remember that someone has already tried it before. And I like oftentimes hear people be like, I've got this brand new idea of a training. I'm like, there's been like 70 million trainees. Like we're done with that. We didn't like say this was like we aren't trying to do this thing because we haven't thought of other ideas. Like there's so many other ideas. So I think like digging into that history and learning is really super important. And those would be like concrete things I think people can do.
I'm gonna just be really blunt and say flank us. You know, as a movement, we're under attack right now. You know, and so I think it's really helpful that when you hear people attack abolition, when you hear people attack defund, you know, to stand in your power and flank us. One of the most powerful moments this summer was when we were down in downtown Brooklyn, you know, day in and day out, protesting the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. They put in place a curfew. The police would corral folks and arrest folks en masse to jail them. And because it was so many people, they needed to use MTA buses to shuttle people from Barclays Center to Brooklyn Detention. And in that moment, the unions of bus drivers, transit workers unions, sent out a tweet, put out a statement. Bus drivers stepped off their buses and said, "We will not transport protesters to jail. We are not the police, we are bus drivers." And just every time I tell the story, I cry, right? But stand in your power. You may not be in an organization, you know, but you belong to a union or you're an educator. You know, when you stand in your power and you support us, you protect us. We have to remember, our parents' Black liberation movement was destroyed by the police, right? Flank us, you know, do what you can. And everything that you do is just so powerful because it legitimizes our struggle and it legitimizes that we actually represent our folks.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing that example of everyone has a role to play, right? And so thank you for lifting that.
I was trying to put something in the chat that I thought would be a good resource around that question versus abolition versus reform, and which kinds of reforms are not actually helpful, from Critical Resistance. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm just bad at multitasking. I think I don't really have much to add. You know, when COVID hit, my dad, I mentioned before, he now works as a janitor, and he actually cleans the juvenile hall in Alameda County, where we fought a campaign to downsize and relocate that juvenile hall. But when COVID hit, and, you know, and still prisons are a public health crisis before COVID and even worse now. And each day he's going to work, you know, I'm just thinking about, why is my dad continuing to risk his life to go to a place where young people are in cages, where any people are in cages? And it was that kind of proximity to harm that had me start to kind of question, you know, people talked about the journey that folks have been on, that had me start to question kind of some of my own past stances on particular reforms. And, you know, Cory Booker is not somebody who I look to or agree with often, but he said something today on Twitter that I thought was appropriate. Justice will never be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And I think, you know, what you've heard is like folks' outrage and folks' demand for real dignity. And I hope that everybody who's on the call is really doing some personal reflection. And if you're at an institution that funds this work, really funding, as I said, bold organizing to move us in the direction that we need to move.
Thank you. Manuela posted in the chat, how do people practice abolition on a personal level and at an organizational level? And I want to flag that we have 3 more minutes together.
I actually love the question at a personal level. Like everything you can do can be around abolition, right? It is possible, and we can change actions and relationships. We can deepen relationships. We can learn. We can, you know, resist punishment, separation, and that oppression in our lives. And we can work on building our own accountability. And it's lots of personal work that we can do on a day-to-day level. at an organizational level, like, yeah, that's going to be depending on your organization, right? Like some organizations aren't abolitionists, and sometimes practicing abolition organization is saying you're not abolitionist, right? And having an honesty around that, and then doing the insight game to, you know, create the spaces that you can create. I think it's super important to decrease isolation around people that are in spaces of inside game but are abolitionists, right? So it may not be that you're going to find that person in your organization, but you might find another person who's in a similarly situated like nonprofit industrial complex who's an abolitionist, and y'all need to come together, right? So like if you are in an organization that's not abolitionists, then I think it's incumbent on you to find another abolitionist who's in an organization and think about how you're going to strategize and map those ideas out together and support each other, right? Just like, because that can be a really difficult space to be in.
Thank you for that. And so I just want to share some. Ashley, do you want to share some closing thoughts, and then I'll close this out?
Thanks. I will just say I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunity to be in the conversation. I think I don't really have anything that's super profound other than to really just echo what Monifa said about like flanking the movement and really doing the work to, you know, for those with resources, to make sure that the things that we are advocating for, the statements that we're making are not being undermined and not being diluted also. I think sometimes folks come in and say like, oh, defund really means, and they say something that's very reformist, and that's like, it means what it means. And so really thinking about how can we use our positions of power and influence to support the narrative that is coming from organizers, and rather than substituting our judgment for the work that organizers are doing.
Thank you. I want to send a virtual round of applause. Thank you, Erin, Zach, Ashley, Monifa, for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation. I wish we had 24 more hours to really dig deep. You know, we're just beginning to scratch the surface. The work of abolition, it is both personal and it is political. It is intersectional. It is cross-sectoral, right? And and abolition as a frame exists in our lives and everything that we do. And again, thank you so much. For those of you who are in the audience, please, you guys are getting lots of applause in the chat. Please do fill out the survey so that as we're thinking towards 2021, we know what type of programming to schedule and what will be most useful for you all. This is part one of an ongoing conversation. I'm so excited to be in community with you all and to be in movement with you all. Deep gratitude. And we are going to close out here. Have a good day, everyone. Take care. Bye.